when you go through your reentry process, when you go through your own way of finding your way back to life and things are hard, find that thing that brings you to peace, no matter what, reminds you that we are timeless and infinite and grander than the whole universe.
This is Your Kick-Ass Life podcast, episode number 366 with guest Christina Rasmussen.
This is the Your Kick-Ass Life podcast with Andrea Owen, a no BS guide to self-help and badassery. Because ladies, let's face it, life's too short for it to not kick ass. And here's your host, the girl who serves it up straight with a side of crazy, Andrea Owen.
Hey there, ass kickers. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. I am so glad that you are here. I want to say thank you, first and foremost. Thank you to those of you who filled out the survey that we had last month. We got such an impressive turnout for those of you that filled it out. And I was so touched that so many of you took the time to tell us what you think, to give us your feedback about the show. As I've mentioned, I want this to be better for you. This is all about you and what you are getting out of it. And your time is so valuable. It is a non-renewable resource. And until we create time machines, well, it's going to be non-renewable and it's important. And I want to make sure that your time is valued and that you are getting something from these shows. So thank you for filling that out. We're still combing through all of the answers and the feedback that you gave us. So I appreciate you so much gratitude to those of you who took the time to fill that out. We're talking about grief today. And 2020 has been quite a year. Grief as in, yes, people passing away, but everything from job loss to grieving our old lives before COVID. And Christina Rasmussen is here, and I was connected to her by a friend. She was introduced to me by my friend Amy Ehlers, and she's like, I know you just need to talk to her. You need to have her on the show. Your people are just going to love her. I could listen to her list out her grocery list. Like I could listen to her all day. She has one of those amazingly soothing voices that was just made for radio. And I cannot wait for you to hear this conversation. She's written a couple books. I am going to read her fancy bio and tell you about them. And I want to just make one quick announcement that we have a couple of spots open for private coaching. So for those of you who feel like it's a hell yes to get more support, for those of you who feel like maybe you have an inkling of just a kind of a tapping on the shoulder, you might want to fill out the application. Sometimes that in and of itself can feel like a coaching session and make some shifts in your life and point to some things that you might want to work on. So you can head on over to yourkickasslife.com/apply. We've made it easy for you over there, and we will respond and let you know what is the best fit for you. All right, let's get on with the show and have this deep and transformative conversation. For those of you that don't know anything about Christina, let me tell you about her. Christina Rasmussen is an acclaimed grief educator, the author of Second Firsts and Where Did You Go? She is also the host of the Dear Life podcast. She is the creator of the Life Reentry model and has helped countless people break out of what she coined the waiting room of grief to rebuild their lives through her Life Reentry model. With this, she introduces a new model of grief based on the science of neuroplasticity. She describes grief as a catalyst for redefining identity and outlines the process of reentry or returning to life. So without further ado, here is Christina. Christina, thank you so much for being here.
I am so excited to be here, Andrea.
I love that we have never met before. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and as soon as you came onto the Zoom call, we jumped into the deep end together and started talking about my deceased father.
Yes.
That's I know kind of your realm, if I may. And I want to, everyone got a small introduction of you in the beginning about the work that you do, but I want to ask you a question. This is something that I read on your website that was so intriguing to me. And you talk about redefining entry. And you say that grief is a catalyst for redefining entry. Can you speak more on that, about your philosophy on grief and the process of reentry or returning to life?
So when a very catastrophic event happened in my life, which was the loss of my first husband. He was 35 years old. We had two little girls, and even my body couldn't experience that loss. I thought I was going to die from pain.
Yeah.
I thought I wished it was me dying. He was, my mind kept saying he was the better parent. He was the smarter person. He was the better person to stay alive. And he was the love of my life. I couldn't imagine living in this world without him.
Oh my gosh.
And I didn't know how I was going to physically make it. Like I thought my body was going to burst, was going to just explode. I was going to just die. And I used to be also, I have a master's in counseling psychology, and my thesis on grief and the stages of bereavement. I was obsessed with grief and how we find our way back to living after we lose someone we loved. So when this happened to me, it kind of shook the foundation of academia, the foundation of knowledge and psychology that I had. I turned around and said to myself, you have got to be kidding me. This is what has been happening to millions of people, and this is all we have to help them. And reentry became the word that I used to find my way back out of what I coined the waiting room. And the waiting room is when something bad happens in our lives, whether it's a death, a divorce, a job loss, or an invisible loss. I call the smaller, seemingly smaller events of our lives invisible because nobody thinks of them as important, but actually they are catalysts for depression and anxiety and fear in our life. But any of those events, when they happen to us, we don't just start over. We don't just start a new chapter. We don't just leap out of the old life and land in a brand new one. We go in a place in between the life we were forced out of and the life that we could have. And millions of people die in the place in between, thinking that is their new life. That's the life they were supposed to have after their losses. And it's just a waiting space. And the brain puts us in that place when we're grieving, but it keeps us there when we are afraid to start again. And my work and my mission in life is to help all these people re-enter to a true life.
Wow. Okay. I knew that you had lost your first husband when you were younger and your girls were young, but I didn't realize that was your background.
Yes, I know, right?
Oh,
I didn't know why it was.
The irony was not lost on you.
Yeah, and I studied in the UK. I did my bachelor's and my master's in England. And when I was choosing, my thesis, I said to the professor, I got to study grief. I love people so much. I could not possibly imagine losing anyone, right?
So you didn't have any real life experience of losing someone close to you before that?
When I was young, like grandparents,
okay.
Like most people, it was hard, but it wasn't nobody. And the professor turned around and said, you're such a happy person. Why would you want to do this? I said, I just want to do it. And when we moved from the UK to actually at the time to Houston, Texas, and my visa was dependent on my husband's visa, so I was not allowed to work. I started volunteering in hospice. So I sat with the dying. I actually, because of my qualifications, they couldn't pay me. So I started facilitating their support groups. And then when we moved from there to California and then to Boston, when we were in Boston, he was diagnosed at age 31 with stage 4 colon cancer, and it was terminal from the beginning. And Andrea, I knew then this was so much more catastrophic than I ever imagined.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I have so many questions, some of them personal and some of them professional. I'm just going to kind of go with wherever the conversation takes us. Well, okay. So can you talk about, one of the things that you said when you were talking about grief and loss are these, I think you called them invisible losses. Is that also what they were also referred to as, I think they're called ambiguous grief. Brene Brown calls it ambiguous grief. So that's like empty nesters or COVID, I think can be something. Is that the same thing?
So yes. And this kind of, empty nester, COVID, they're all definitely invisible and ambiguous and confusing and not traditional in the death or divorce kind of grief realm. But what is an invisible loss is, imagine something happening to you in your life that is not an event per se, like an empty nest, or it is an experience that broke your heart. It could be a really bad argument with your best friend when you were 15. It could be your first boyfriend making out with your friend. It could be your teacher in school telling you off in front of the whole class.
Being excluded in middle school.
Yes.
Yeah, everybody has some story.
So these little tiny invisible events that we don't get validation for, acknowledgement, and we are not really processing, they actually dictate the narrative of our life. And in the life reentry model that I developed, which by the way is in clinical trial right now, two clinical trials, real clinical trials. People are like, are they real? I said, yes, there's
exciting.
Big funding for those trials. And so there is the narrative that actually dictates our experiences stems from these invisible, seemingly small events that have taken place in our life that we dismiss, we don't really talk about because they're not big enough or they're not considered big enough. And yet, when we take people through that process, Andrea, it's incredible. It almost sheds this light and this awareness of our survivor, I call it the survivor self, the part of us that survived those events and those experiences. And that part has protected us from having those experiences again. And in many ways, it has put us inside that waiting room. So when we get hit by a big loss, like losing your dad, like, getting divorced, losing your spouse, losing a child, the surviving that takes place from your brain, the neural pathways that are here to help you are not brand new. They come from the other events of your life and they take over that conversation. So people say grief lasts forever. It is not. Grief and missing someone does last forever, but the guilt, the shame, the fear, the anxiety, those are the things actually that are much more dangerous after loss, because they're the ones that actually last until the end of our life, and they don't let us leave that stuck place and that waiting room to really experience feeling alive again.
Oh, Christina, I feel like we need to be best friends.
Of course, yes.
Well, I have well, I don't know if tumultuous is a dramatic word, tumultuous relationship with grief and this topic, because we've heard in these worlds that we run in, that if you really want to do the work, walk towards the thing that you're most afraid of. And for a long time for me, it was grief. And I've befriended it and have come a long way. One of the things that you just said that stuck out to me that I am just realizing right now is that my experience with grief has been so interesting. One of the episodes of grief is the loss of my first marriage, and it was trauma. I describe it as traumatic and dramatic exit.
Yes.
And what was so curious for me as the years have gone by is when I am triggered by things that should seemingly be innocuous, that or indirectly related and weird, that will take me out. And it's similar with the death of my father. I told the story a couple times on my podcast, that it wasn't his birthday or the anniversary of death that took me out. It was one time seeing a father and a little girl flying a kite. And I hadn't remembered that memory of my own for decades. And then all of a sudden I'm in a puddle of tears, and I had to take like 2 days off. But there was this one instance this was several years after my divorce, and I was finally finishing my bachelor's degree that it had taken me years and years to finish. I was pregnant with my second child. I was remarried to the most wonderful man. I'm still married to him. And it was the day of my graduation from Cal State University, San Marcos. And I was overcome with grief that my former family wasn't at my graduation party. And it was so strange because that family was big on celebrations, and we're so proud of it. It was a very large family and just lots of parties and celebrating. And they lifted up people who, when there was big events like that, like a graduation or a baby shower or a birthday. And what was my reality was a very small celebration. There wasn't a lot of hoopla. And I was angry that I was mad, that I was having feelings, I should say. And once I surrendered to it and realized, okay, this is just part of my grieving process. This doesn't have anything to do with my ex-husband. This doesn't have anything to do with my former family. But it was exactly what you said, the feelings of shame, the feelings of sadness, of loss, and feeling like, feeling sort of lost in a forest. Like I don't actually know what it is that I'm looking for, but I feel lost. And I'm sure that makes sense to you, as someone who studies this.
You said something really significant, and it is an invisible loss. And this invisible loss is actually, once you learn how to spot them, it's life-changing afterwards. And you said that your former family-in-law were big on celebrations, right? Mm-hmm. And by the way, I got chills because, and I know people would say, why was she having chills about that specific comment? But here's why. When you were in a place later in your life to have a big celebration like that, you actually, deep down, you were grieving not having that big celebration with them.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And
I felt wrong for it in the moment.
And you shouldn't be, because that's how you were grieving. You're grieving this part. Imagine if there's a big puzzle, right? The grief and loss has so many pieces, right? 1,000, 2,000 pieces. And that was just one of the pieces. And I'm so glad you were grieving it, because if it goes unnoticed, unvalidated, unprocessed, it is actually going to interfere in your relationships, in conversations with your children, with your friends, with your marriage today. It just.
And that's part of why I told this story right now and wanted to use that example, is because I know that there's people listening who might have these things happen to them and they make it mean something that it not necessarily is. For a moment I had made it mean that I was not over my ex-husband, and that certainly was not the case. And so I still, that was in 2009 when that happened. And still now it's 2020, and there will be small things that trigger me, but I immediately know it has nothing to do with really anything except my grief, and perhaps my unconscious brain is trying to catch up with 2020, and I'm still trying to heal.
And it's protecting you. So the narrative, the survivor self, which is really the fear center, but I took brain science and created ways in which people can understand what's happening inside the brain. But your survivor self, who has protected you during those very hard moments, is when you're being triggered and activated, it's your survivor self is trying to protect you in this moment, in the 2020. And this is why right now we have so many people struggling. It's not just because of what's happening today in our lives, which is bad enough. It is because we have, with everyone, millions of people have had so much loss in their lives, seen and unseen, traditional and untraditional, and they have coping mechanisms to survive them. And those are the narratives that are taking over. And this is why we see so much anger and just violence and chaos. It's hell right now, because all of those voices are protecting their hosts.
Okay. I would love for you to speak to that a little bit more, because, we're recording this in November of 2020, and over the last, I'm sure your practice is busy. I know my therapist
Yes.
said she's never been busier. I've had a few other therapists on that said they've also never been busier in 2020. And am I correct in understanding that people are, of course, they're scared and uncertain because of COVID and the economic stuff and racial tension and social unrest, but it's also re-traumatizing people about things that happened in their past that don't have anything to do with COVID or the election.
So what is happening is that the brain maps that are there to protect, to put people in a nice, safe space because there's danger outside, are here. And the danger that looks, so when the person is looking outside, they're not just saying, oh, there is COVID, there is, unemployment, there's political unrest. It says your life is in danger today. It is, the narrative is strong. It is much stronger than reality. Not that reality is not dangerous, but imagine it being 10 times worse inside the brain, because the brain wants to protect itself and put everyone in the most safe place. And there is no safe place right now. Everything is unnerving and unsettling. So this is why it looks like everyone is yelling at each other. Everyone is disagreeing. Everyone's being triggered. I guess, yes, we could say they're being re-traumatized, but the way I maybe I'm saying the same thing, but the way I am explaining it to people is that imagine you have this caregiver inside of you, this caretaker, that the bell rings when there's danger for you. So this caretaker runs from wherever it is and comes with this blanket and fire things and like grabs you, even though there's no fire, and says, we have to go. It's like when the president, not necessarily this one, but any president, there's a threat. His bodyguards come and grab him and put him down in the bunker.
So it's like a red alert.
There you go. Yes, like an alarm. It's like a loud alarm that is not necessarily for the present moment, but for everything that's happened before. Yes.
I'm interrupting this conversation to bring you a few words about some of our sponsors. I'm a huge advocate for therapy and counseling. I've been going myself for the past 28 years. And lately, it's kind of inconvenient to go and see someone in person. That's why I recently signed up for BetterHelp and wanted to tell you what I love about it. BetterHelp will assess your needs by asking you a few quick initial questions online and match you with your own licensed professional therapist so you can start communicating in under 24 hours. You can send a message to your counselor anytime. You'll get timely and thoughtful responses. Plus, you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions if you'd rather do that. It's easy and free to change counselors if needed. It's more affordable than traditional in-person counseling, and financial aid is available. There's a broad range of expertise available, so you can get help with things like depression, anxiety, relationships, trauma, family conflicts, LGBTQ matters, grief, and anything you share is always confidential. In fact, so many people have been using BetterHelp that they are recruiting additional counselors in all 50 states. I want you to start living a happier and more fulfilling life today. And as a listener of the show, you get 10% off your first month by visiting betterhelp.com/kickass. Join over 1 million people who have taken charge of their mental health. Again, that's BetterHelp, HELP.com/kickass. Well, how does someone know that they are ready to do the kind of grief work that you do? And is there a time in which you suggest someone doesn't do this work yet?
Yes, I do. Actually, the way to look at life reentry is we are the second responders. We're not the first responders.
Not the first responders. Okay.
Yeah. So when a loss takes place, my work, people call me a grief expert, but I'm really a life expert after grief. So,
okay.
And it stems from grief, but it's, people say to me, you picked up where Elizabeth Kubler-Ross with the stages of bereavement left off. I'm after the mourning, after the stages go through. So when people come to ask this question, Christina, should I buy your book? Should I come to these classes that you do? What should I do? And I say life reentry is here when you feel that you want to start your life over, but you're afraid, you're stuck, you have anxiety, you feel depressed. Grief is a different kind of feeling. Grief is raw. It's mourning. It's love upside down. It's not the way fear looks like. It's a different thing. The waiting room gets created when we are getting ready to re-enter, and the survivor self comes and says, don't go out again because this is going to happen to you again. So when that happens, that's when we start the life reentry process. And we do it very, very gently and very carefully. I call it, we have to sneak out so the survivor self doesn't hear us leave the waiting room for an overnight visit. So the first few steps out are very, very quiet. And we should not be activating our fear center at all in the beginning.
As someone who snuck out of the house a lot in high school, I will also tell you that take the screen off first.
Yes.
during daylight hours, because that can be loud. I want to touch on people listening who might be experiencing grief for the first time, and they might be asking themselves, if they go through the reentry process or, when they return to life, does that mean that they won't experience waves of grief anymore? Does that mean that they're going to forget about their loved one? Like, what about people who are sort of, because I feel like people, and tell me if I'm wrong, kind of hang on to their grief as a way to sort of honor the person or thing that they've lost?
Yeah. And this is a great question. And the way I always respond to this is that reentry cannot touch the grief at all. Unfortunately, the grief cannot be changed. It has to be felt and expressed and cried out and all those things. Reentry is here for all the other things that are taking place because of the grief. When you go through, let's say the first time you go through reentry for the first time, and you're 2 years after your loss, it's a good time to say, okay, now I've grieved and cried and I spent time in the waiting room, which is actually a very healing place when it is used for grief. But when it is used because we're afraid to start over, then it becomes more of a prison where we end up staying there for a long time because the brain gets used to the comfort of the waiting room. And one of the dangerous things about COVID is that we are all put into this waiting room right now. And the more we stay in our homes with our pajamas on, with eating pizza every night, right? And the more we don't have a reason to go out to, showcase our new shoes and be social and, all those things, the harder it's going to be when the time comes for us to go out. People think they want COVID to be gone, and we do. But when it's here, when the time comes and we are free to go out without masks and all that stuff, it's going to actually be really hard for people to do that because the brain is used to being at home and working from here and doing everything from here. And we're used to that waiting room. So life reentry requires many versions. It's almost like rewiring your brain. And bringing awareness and skills as to hearing the distinguishing between the three selves. The life reentry has three personalities, and knowing when the survivor is creating the narrative and when not. And when the survivor is there, we have tools and ways to quiet the survivor down. Unfortunately, we can never get rid of that survivor, ever, never. It will never go away. We just know how to handle it. We are more aware of what it is that we are thinking and feeling. And we can also actually see the survivor selves from other people, which is my favorite thing to do.
You mean we see our own survivor self through other people, or we see theirs?
Theirs. We see our own, but we see theirs, and we can tell when someone is going to get triggered. If we know about their life and we know them, we can tell what's going to tick them off, and we can actually have compassion for them.
I was just about to say that. That's helped me have compassion for other people.
Yeah. And not get too mad and, pissed off and run away from them. They're just being triggered by their own survivor self. That's all there is.
I find myself wanting, and this would probably scare the crap out of people if I ask this question, but when I meet someone and I start to see their personality traits come through, this doesn't happen with every person I meet, but there's one person I'm thinking of that we play tennis with, and I so badly want to ask this person, who broke your heart and what happened? And it's not that this person's angry. This person's a little passive aggressive, and I know something happened, and I know this person probably doesn't want to talk about it, but I'm so curious. I can viscerally feel it, and it's happened to me before, and it's much stronger with certain people, and it used to make me very uncomfortable, but now I've learned to manage it a little bit better. As someone who identifies as an empath, and I know where I begin and they end and all of that. But it's, so much compassion for these people.
Yeah. And I'm like you. I want to, I went to your website and I was like, oh my gosh. And immediately she went through this. And then I tried to imagine you as a person because of those things. And like, we are so alike. I mean, I because knowing the story, and when we ask that question from someone, what's your story? There's actually many stories that make the main story, that they have this similar thread. And that survivor is actually made from the average of those stories, and they have a common thread. People, alcoholism, for example, any kind of addiction, food, whatever that is, there's just coping mechanisms. And we know that from those.
I know that. Yeah. As someone who identifies as an addict alcoholic, I've been sober for 9 years. I didn't never really want to drink or fall in love with a stranger or restrict calories. I wanted to run away from my life. I wanted to run away from the feelings. That's what I was doing.
And Andrea, we've never met. And when I was reading your website, I said to myself, this woman, like, you were supposed to, you have such a big, like, your energy is bigger than your life.
Thank you. I love that. Thank you. I'm going to put that in my back pocket. It's
vast. You have like this vastness.
And it scares me sometimes.
And when it doesn't fit, in your life, that's when things happen, right? And you have a big life, but like, we're talking about Grand Canyon life. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I'm like?
Yeah.
This is when you're going to feel at home, even though it scares you.
Yes. And now my palms are sweating hearing you say that, because
I hope it's okay that I said that
so much. No. I believe you wholeheartedly. Yeah. And I believe too that you have some kind of mediumship or something where you can communicate with realms that I cannot see. And also, I've had many a tarot card and psychic tell me the same thing, and people who haven't met me. There was actually a psychic who told my mother that when I was about 6 months old on her hip, and about me. So I believe you. And
I have chills, by the way. I have chills.
Oh my gosh.
I'm so glad I have chills. I wish I would share. Like, I'm so glad that you've been told this many times before, because as soon as I landed on your website, I just read literally 2 minutes in, and I said, even your foot, like everything about you tells me grand. And when it's not at that level, at that huge, I mean, we're talking big level, it's hard to fit into that slightly smaller space.
Yes. And I will say this for people listening, that as a woman, knowing that and feeling that when I was younger, and then if I would act on it and sort of embrace my natural abilities and was told to quiet down, that your energy is too much, your laugh is too loud, people can't take you seriously if you smile that big, and all of these things that are incredibly triggering to me, that I'm 45 now, and it's taken me about this long to fully embrace who I am. And for those of you listening, whether you have, a boisterous personality or you're more introverted and more introspective, which we need those people too. And
Yes.
I wish that, well, I'm actually going to take that back. I was going to say, I wish I didn't have to go through what I went through in order to fully embrace. I have learned, one thing I have learned is to give people the dignity of their own process. And it really is just about being self-aware enough and accepting of yourself enough to learn from all of the shitstorms and wrong turns and, addictions and all of it, in order to fully step into the woman that you were meant to be. And I wish that for everyone.
And Andrea, you said something so important, when people were telling you not to be so loud, not to be this and that. We not only have the survivor within ourselves, we also have external survivor selves that belong to other people, and your light scares them, and they will try to shut it down because of their own story.
Yeah. Yes. And I actually wrote about that. I just turned in my manuscript a few weeks ago for my third book that comes out next year. And there's a chapter, I think it's one of the very first ones, because I know some people don't read the entire book, about shining too bright because we have a fear of outshining others, and taking up space, because and that's another conversation for another time. But I want to circle back, because you were talking about these 3 different parts of ourselves. So is that the same when you're talking about that versus the 3 phases of reentry?
No,
are those different?
Yeah. So the life reentry has 5 steps.
Okay.
And the foundation of those 5 steps is, basically the process gets you out of the waiting room. That's the, imagine life reentry being a tiny place between counseling and coaching.
Okay.
It is not coaching and it is not counseling. It's life reentry. There's a gap people don't make when they go from their therapists, because they've gone through something really difficult, to their coaches. I'm
going to stop you for a second. For people who don't know what that is. So counseling and therapy, generally speaking, is about looking at your past, and coaching, generally speaking, is about looking at your future. So you're talking about like the in-between.
Life reentry is a bridge.
Okay. Between those 2.
So imagine you have to jump between 2 buildings, and the space between those buildings is too large for some people.
Okay.
And they can't go from talking about their feelings and grieving their past and just, discussing things, to what is the biggest goal of your life.
That's a big jump.
Yes.
It's like going from A to Z in 1 second.
Especially for someone who's grieving, or for someone who's gone through a devastating divorce like you did, Andrea, and someone who lost a spouse, a child, and they've had therapy for 2 years, let's say. Like they've really done their work, and they're like, now I'm ready to start my life over, right? I'm going to go and do this. And then they go into this beautiful world of coaching, which is amazing, right? So I used to be a coach. That's how I came up with this model, because I started using the methodology I was taught, which is amazing and great and wonderful. And I started seeing this pattern that people wanted to say yes to those things, and they wanted them. But by the next session, the ones that had just gone through something really devastating, they couldn't actually, something was pulling them back. And I was like, what is that thing? Where are they going? What's happening? And that's how I started to make these discoveries. And so life reentry occupies a very small space, but it's actually a very significant one. The one that makes your journey from therapy to, life coaching and making big goals. When we're done with life reentry, or when we are in a place where we can say, I'm breathing fresh air again, I understand myself, I know my inner narrative. The inner world is actually much larger than the outer world. Now I'm ready to start choosing goals and dreams that belong to the new identity that is here. And the three selves, which are, when I created them, my first book was published in 2013, and it was called Second Firsts. And the life reentry model premiered for the first time in that book. And I was like, at night, my survivor self would say, Christina, people think you're crazy creating these selves and personas. And I was so scared that I was never going to be able to practice this work because professionals would take me down. But none of those things happened. The three selves: the survivor self, the watcher self, and the thriver self. The watcher self is the witness, the part of you that has been with you since day one and has all the wisdom and all the knowing about you. Imagine this elder. When we go through something difficult and the survivor narrative takes over, we actually forget our own wisdom. And the only way to true reentry and living life is through that wisdom. So I call that part the watcher self, because they have been watching all this time. And then the thriver self is the kid self before loss. So we actually connect to that self in the last step, the thriver self. And we allow for that voice to be remembered, and that had no surviving, that had just fun and play and freedom. Yeah.
Okay. And so that you wrote about in Second Firsts?
But for the grieving, traditional grieving people, and then we had Hay House wanted to do a new edition in 2019, which added a little bit of that more invisible loss portion. Yeah.
Okay. And so the book, Where Did You Go? That's totally separate than Second First, correct?
Yes, that was in 2018. Yeah.
2000. Okay. And we'll drop those links in the show notes too. And so I'm curious about the watcher self. Are you a believer, and are you talking about angels and guides that are with us?
That is the super watcher, which is in the Where Did You Go book. The watcher self is not a supernatural. It is the knowing that we have about our life, about our physical world, about deep down, Andrea, you actually have a very strong watcher. You have a lot of knowledge about yourself and about others. And the only time you lose that knowledge is when the survivor narrative is loud and takes over.
Okay. Makes a lot of sense to me, Christina.
It really does, doesn't it?
Oh, I love getting to have these kind of conversations with people. Like I dig it so much, and I dig you so much.
Same here.
I have, I'm going to have you back on. I'm telling you now that you're going to have to come back on next year, because I still have so many questions. And is there anything before we close that you want to say, that you want to add on to anything that you said, that you want to make sure that the listeners walk away with?
I want to say that, even when we figure things out, when we find our way to a good place, we will get hit again many times from loss. That's life. That's the way it is. And the one place that I find the most peace is space. It is the knowing that there's a grander design. I am actually in love with the quantum world, physics, and understanding what reality is made of. And for everyone who's listening, when you go through your reentry process, when you go through your own way of finding your way back to life, and things are hard, find that thing that brings you to peace, no matter what. It reminds you that we are timeless and infinite and grander than the whole universe.
Yes, ma'am. I want to record just that little section and play it on my phone to myself. And do you want people, what's the best place you want people to go to learn more about you and to find you?
Okay, ChristinaRasmussen.com is the main site. Secondfirst.com is the blog. LifeReentry.com is the institute, and DearLifePodcast.com is the podcast.
Yes, Dear Life Podcast, and all those links will be in the show notes. Thank you, Christina, for being here. And listeners, you know how much I value your time. Thank you for being here with me and my guest today. And remember, it's our life's journey to make ourselves better humans and our life's responsibility to make the world a better place. Bye, everybody.